Hmm. Ooh, let me try it. This looks awesome. Why is this not working? Why does this look so weird? Why is brush pen so freaking hard? Have you ever seen a drawing made with a brush pen and you felt like, oh wow, that looks freaking awesome. I can do that. And you take the brush pen and you start drawing and you miserably start to realize you can't, and this is a freaking hard medium. You're not alone. We all have been there. I have been there for the last 2 years probably. In 2022, I have seen Kim Young-ji drawing live with a brush pen for the first time. Before that, I always have seen people drawing with the brush pen, and I tried it, I failed, and I tried it again, and I failed again. 2022, I decided that I wanted to give it another shot, and now a bit more serious. And of course, not everyone is the same, and just because someone like Kim Young-ji dominate this medium means that everyone has to do it as well. Maybe it was my ego, or maybe it was my curiosity. I hope it was number two. I decided to tackle this whole problem a little bit differently. So today I want to talk about why it is so hard to draw with the brush pen. I also want to share capacities, possibilities, mistakes you maybe run into, and my personal experience from the last 2 years of trying this medium. By the end of this video, hopefully I can give you like 1 or 2 tips that will at least help you on your journey if you decide to go with the brush pen. So here we go. By the way, if you're new here, my name is Enosh. I'm a concept artist in games and movies for the past 7 years, and I'm also a full-time teacher. The brush pen is a bit like an older sibling. Sometimes you love them and sometimes... So what is a brush pen? It is literally just a brush in the front and a cartridge in the back, which is filled with ink. And you can control that ink flow through pressing that cartridge. And the more you press, the more ink comes out. But this also gives a lot of cool opportunities to adjust the outcome of the brush pen. But more to this later. Using a brush pen can also be very dangerous, because if you press too much, they can come out a lot of ink, and maybe you not intend to have so much ink. Unfortunately, sometimes the way the ink comes out of the pen is a bit unpredictable. Whenever you intend to fly abroad, put your brush pen in a separate plastic bag, because under high altitude pressure, they might to implode. 2024, when I went on a business trip, I opened up my bag and it was full with ink. And luckily, I'm automatically putting those in an extra bag, but I didn't have in my mind that those can implode. And when you leave the airport, you don't want to look like you just robbed the bank. So the first thing that we need to learn is how to handle and press this brush pen in a certain way to get the right amount of ink out of the pen. It's not very complicated, it's not very hard, it's just a matter of trying and feeling how much do you press and how much you should not press. The upside of this system is something that is really cool, and I personally really like, is something that they call the dry brush effect. So let's say you want to draw a female figure or like a bikini girl, and you quickly want to add a bit of tone and value to the clothing. With the dry brush effect, you can basically press down the brush and just scratch it over the surface. That gives this light tonality tone to the clothing. Also a great effect to draw hair or fur or any type of clothing texture. Anything that also could be a dry material works perfectly with this effect. And not to forget, patterns are really good for all these different effects you can control. But the hard part of this is to control how much ink comes out of the brush. My first tip here is either way always having an extra tissue with you where you can basically see and control how much ink is there coming out right now. Or you have a separate sheet of paper on your side where you just slightly give it a little stroke and see how much ink comes out to see, okay, the dry effect effect is working right now. Bigger problem that I had when I drew my big samurai piece around a year ago was that in the time that I spent, which was around 20 hours, my hand started really to hurt while using the brush pen. I basically got cramps in the hand. It was either way the thickness of the brush or the heaviness of the brush, and also every small detail I tried to draw started really affecting my hand. And usually I do not consider myself having a weak grip, but handling the brush pen requires a little bit of delicacy when you try to handle it. That made me coming to the conclusion that I would rather use more a traditional brush with an extra ink compartment for those pieces, because I would spend more time. And the difference is brush is way lighter, way slimmer, but maybe it's also personalized. Maybe you can handle the paint much better than I can. Did you know that the intention of Kim Young-ji starting with the brush pen was actually to just speed up his demonstrations? Because he knew that the brush pen was a powerhouse when it came to speed, but also when it came to just fill a page or a canvas or even a wall in his case, because you could fill that wall very quick with a lot of ink and it would have much more punch, because you do not only can add slim or thicker lines with the brush pen, you can also add big splashes of ink paint or big strokes or shapes, or render it with the dry brush effect. Sometimes he would smear a little bit the ink, you know. And exactly this is the biggest strong suit of the brush pen. The speed and the amount of this. If you can control that brush pen, you are able to add a lot of ink and fill much more space in a fastest majority of time. But, and it's a big but, this is also the biggest downfall for every aspiring artist trying to draw with the freaking brush pen. Because you automatically get faster, but you also have to make decisions much quicker. And with quicker decisions, they come also more mistakes. And Kim Young-ji said so many times that he would do so many mistakes and he would just learn to cover them up in the process. But mistakes are basically just the secondary outcome of using the brush pen. Which the more I used this pen, it made more sense for me. Because you always have the option to either darken or black things out when you spot an error on hair or anything else. If you more tend to be a heavy-handed person like I am, or more a light-handed person, those mistakes will also occur more often. Especially when you just start to learn controlling the line with the brush pen. My tip here, use the pinky finger. With the power of the pinky finger, you have a better sense of distance between the brush and the surface of the paper. That enables you a little bit more control when pressing down the tip. I'm reading the script. I'm losing my head. Stockable paper. Let me quickly throw this at my window because I have pigeons and they freaking annoy me. Talking about paper, we also need to talk about the size and the surface we are using and acquired to draw with the brush pen on. Let's start with size. One of my biggest mistakes in the beginning, trying to draw with the brush pen in a very small sketch like this. Problem, when you have no control with the brush pen on something very small and you press too much, you will mess up the drawing even more. The chance to mess it up much higher, and it's much more discouraging. And I always try to fill those smaller sketchbook pages with the brush pen, and that would go very quick, but all the drawings would look horrible. So I have at least 2 or 3 sketchbooks laying around which look like Maniac would go with ink in there and everything looks horrible. That's the point. From what I've learned, it is actually better, especially with a brush pen, to draw with bigger paper or bigger size paper. A4 or even bigger. Imagine you're heavy-handed in a little sketchbook, you sit in a subway and you draw something and then someone rambles and you do like and then the whole thing is full. So not very optimal. Or you try to draw like an eye of a face, like everything was perfect, and you go in to draw the eye and then like you just and then everything is black. Cool, nice, awesome, I'm happy. No, I'm not, I'm lying. So trying to control this medium on a small surface is really like trying to win an Elden Ring with no items. So again, I realized that using a brush pen is actually better for bigger formats. But that doesn't mean that the brush pen is not coming in different sizes. The brush pen comes in small, medium, big, very big, different colors, different tips, fine, thick, or even small, right? Super small, super fine. And For every beginner, I would recommend go for the smallest size. You make your life so much easier. Also, there are some brush pens who have harder tips, you know? So they're not that soft and flexible. They're much more stiff and you feel that. Go for something soft. And those brush sign pens are really my secret tip here. Okay, good. When it comes to paper, you are technically super flexible. Smooth paper, which is more used by comic book artists who use a lot of ink, are very good because it absorbs the ink pretty good. You can also go for something medium, which is not technically made for ink, but it still works really great because it absorbs the right amount of ink and it's not bleeding. What is a bit more difficult if you have a rough surface paper, because the rough surface paper will absorb a lot of ink and it also will not be so smooth to draw on. Plus, maybe shapes you want to create or lines you want to create always will look a bit edged out at the end because of the reaction of surface and ink. Talking about shapes. What I learned a bit later is that I really started to enjoy using the side of the brush. Because when you start to realize the power of using some shapes which are almost graphical, or even using the side to create a shape that could be a texture or could be a pattern, or it could be like if you would try to paint some leaves with the ink. That goes very well. Even shadow shapes, nice hard-edged shadow shapes. It's very powerful because the accessibility into control is so easy. And also if you compare it to using a normal brush, the result is very similar, or I would almost say it's almost the same result. So I would say the brave and bold, they get rewarded with happy accidents. Something that gets a bit trickier with the brush pen is rendering in general. Because of course, if I use a brush and I have separate ink and water, I can water the ink down. I can create different values in a grayscale. Of course, you can use the pure black of the brush pen as an ambient occlusion shadow. You could even go that far and try to use it for cast shadows. But obviously, creating a grayscale or a tonal change and difference in gray tones is much easier with a brush because you can water down the ink and create different type of grays. And that's something you technically not directly can do with that's something that you technically not can do with a brush pen. Unless you have maybe water with you or some separate splash of water. You could try to do that as well. Or as I mentioned before, you can also take a dry piece of paper and try to dry out the brush itself in order to create this rendering effect, applying it to the paper while drawing on it. So what Kim Young-ji liked to do was using his finger to smear the ink while applying it on the surface, which is for somebody like me who always has sweaty hands a very dangerous scenario. Don't get me wrong, having provided liquid is not really my problem. That sounded very wrong. Hashtag no sexual. Anyways, it is more that I start to forget that I have ink all over my fingers. And while I'm drawing, I just press my fingers on the paper. Maybe could do something to the image that I don't want. But at the end, we're all artists and whatever ends up on the canvas, ends up on the canvas. Adding midtones can be a bit tricky. And if you compare it with a brush, you have a way easier life while using a brush. You still have the option to use a separate wet brush or to use some extra water to water down the ink a little bit or to dry it out. Wo sind die brush pens? Tilting or rotating the pen can add a very subtle effect to the texture and the line you're drawing. If you combine that with the pressure sensitivity we just talked about, you can create some really interesting lines going from something slim to thick, which is perfect for something like hair strokes. Depending on how hard you press down, you can control the thickness of the line. Also, a beginner-friendly tip from my side, if you feel like still the finest line is too much for you, you can also start with an ink pen and then try to apply the brush pen later. You can also switch in between and maybe you create a complete new look or complete new effect for you. Because the brush pen is also very powerful in things such as thumbnail drawings for environments. Actually, when I worked in studio, I was using them for super little thumbnails in my sketchbook. Because of the speed, but also the amount of ink I can get out, I can just work with composition and the shadow shapes I want to add to that composition. So as you maybe know now, you need a lot of patience And you need continuous practice and a routine in order to master this freaking medium, okay? And if you're not the type of person who goes into tunnel vision or fighting your demons every time you try to draw something with a brush pen and it doesn't turn out the way you want it to, I have a really cool game that you can play by yourself, do by yourself, or also play with your friends. And I call it the indication game. The indication game. I call it the indication game. The indication game. So here's the setup. Of course, you need a brush pen, paper, or you can take a whiteboard, or you can also make paper cards. And I think paper cards are actually the best solution if you play it in a group of friends. So first you need to create a deck of cards. Those cards are filled with words, phrases, objects, or actions. What you also need to do is a timer, so you can take your smartphone, make a timer for 60 seconds, 2 minutes, depending on the difficulty. So you can divide into teams, or you can also play free for all or solo. You can still follow me? Great. Now I want to give you some constraints you also need to map out. Obviously, there are some constraints while drawing with the brush pen. So for example, there is the line limitation. You are only allowed a limited amount of strokes. 5 strokes, 10 strokes, 20 strokes. This forces you to be clever with your line. And it also teaches you line and brush economy. Another constraint is the stroke weight bonus. So you get awarded with extra points when you have at least 3 different types of line thickness in there. The speed sketch round. Draw as fast as possible and only use heavy, broad strokes. This whole thing adds chaos and energy. It also makes you lose. And it encourages you to be expressive in your drawing. Accuracy versus expression. You get bonus points for using expressive marks to convey emotion, texture, or movement, even if the drawing is extremely abstract or stylized. That doesn't matter. The ink efficiency mode. You must avoid over-inking. So no thick black patches. And that is very interesting, you prioritize negative space and subtle brush control. This is my favorite, by the way. The emotion drawing challenge. What you basically try to do is you try to draw emotion such as anger, jealousy, happy. And players need to guess only on the brush strokes what it is. That forces you the creative way of using texture and motion. The one-line brush. You must draw the entire image with one continuous line, with no lifting and no cheating, okay? Or I come by and slap the brush pen out of you. This enhances the flow and the rhythm of using the brush pen. You can also create some extra cards, which can work as random modifiers. And you can write down things such as use only the tip, only use vertical strokes, or only use horizontal strokes, or draw with your non-dominant hand. Or you even go like no outlines, only shading. And to find a winner, of course, we need to have a scoreboard. And to determine a winner, we need a scoreboard. So you get 1 point if you fill in a constraint such as limit amount of strokes, variation in line work, you get 1 plus extra point. And you get plus 2 points for any expressive, stylish, or most creative solution. And at the end, the team needs to choose a winner. But if we're honest here, if everyone drew and had fun, everyone is a winner. Now subscribe, like, and conquer the world with a brush pen.